Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to address a very concerning and chaotic time in our supply chains. There are so many problems in need of solutions, and you, as supply management professionals, are uniquely positioned to solve many of them. I'm Nicole Leonardi, the Director of Corporate Accounts with CAPS Research, and joining me today is our Executive Director, Deb Stanton. As most of you are aware, CAPS Research is a nonprofit supply management research center at Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona, and we focus on research and best practices of supply management. Because of the importance of today's topic, we have opened this webinar and the accompanying benchmarking report up to the public. Now let me turn it over to Deb for a few introductory remarks.
Hi, thanks, Nicole. Let me also welcome you to this webinar today. And let me begin by saying that I have spent years and years as a supply management professional. And I've worked for some wonderful companies in manufacturing like Honeywell and Whirlpool, and also companies in the services sector, most recently a CPO at MasterCard. And I have to say that I have never experienced anything so abrupt and monumental as this crisis. In fact, I would say at some of these companies, we were really, really good at emergency preparedness, and we did practice drills every year. We ran company-wide drills, but now this. Practice helps, but I know the real thing is very, very scary. So here at CAPS, we really are about a wonderful network of professionals, and we know that we come together and we can support each other, we can learn from each other, and most importantly, we can share practices that really make us all stronger. So that's what we'll do here today. I want to get started by sharing insights and analysis with you today. We did a survey, and I want to first profile that for you. So I think it's really important for you to know that we asked CPOs from major corporations questions on the challenges that they're experiencing, the actions that their companies are taking, and then specifically what their supply management organizations are doing during these really unprecedented times. So on the slide, you can see that we have responses from 74 CPOs from major companies. And these major companies that responded to our request and provided us input and answers represent more than $1.8 trillion in revenue. So this is really quite a substantial base with answers and inputs coming from leaders that represent truly some significant companies. As you can see, 84% of the companies are headquartered in the United States, but we did have some international participants, and so we had 16% companies from outside of the U.S. We collected our data between March 12th and March 19th. So at best, it's 14 days old, and as most recent as only 7 days old. But even though it's just 1 to 2 weeks old, it may certainly have already changed with how fast the environment is changing out there. So I'm also showing you sector data. As some of you are familiar with CAPS, we often analyze our data by sector. It does help you relate a little bit better with the data because we will take our data and also break it down by sector and show you some sector information, data, and charts. And you will then relate to companies that are more similar to yours. And sometimes our metrics change sector to sector. So instead of an aggregate, it will give you some of those breakdowns and let you see data that's somewhat more relatable to you and then more meaningful to you to be able to take back into your corporations. So you'll see that our breakdown of respondents, our CPOs came from 45% came from manufacturing, 34% came from the processes sector, and 22% came from the services sector. Sometimes we get a question on who's in the process sector. So that is typically companies like utilities, some energy, chemical processing. So those types of companies make up our process sector. I want to share just a little bit of a fun fact with you. There's often not a whole lot of fun in a topic like we have in front of us today. However, it is arbitrary data, but I took the company stocks of our respondents who, and I took their stock price when we opened the survey on March 12th. And then I also took their stock price when we closed the survey on March 19th and just looked at the delta and the movement in those stock prices. And it was fun to see that actually 25% of the companies, their 1 week performance increased in their stock price, and the other 75% of the companies experienced that stock decrease, but not everybody. And so sometimes it's just a little bit refreshing to see, a little bit of positive in all of this. And so again, the dates were very arbitrary. I do not know if the markets were actually up or down on those particular days. I just took it from the day 1 of the survey to day 2 of the survey. So now let's get a little bit into the data. The first question we asked was just that very, very high level, and that is, what is the nature of activity? And we wanted to know at this point, had companies gone full out and were really engaging and had high levels of actions underway across their entire company, across their entire enterprise. And you can see virtually all of the companies, 97% reported, yes, they were all out, high level of activities underway, and a very small percentage were more specifically targeted at hot zones. So moving on to a little bit more detail, for many, the first major impact was the U.S. imposing the travel ban. And we asked companies about the impact that they were experiencing from these U.S. imposed travel bans. So the most recent being Europe, and you'll see that data here laid in. And you can see the impact, the percent of companies that indicated that this impact was something that they were experiencing. So 49% of the companies said, we are experiencing significant disruption to employee interaction, internal employee interactions because of the Europe travel ban. And then prior to the Europe travel ban, we obviously had the China ban, which was imposed on January 31st. And that's actually the day we actually started collecting these responses. And so here is those impacts that people anticipated because of the China travel ban. So it lets you compare the two and see that there were somewhat different impacts recorded in the percent of companies responding to this. Let me take a look at the the 2 points at the top of the chart. It's the disruptions of employees and of suppliers. When I flip these out for you and have you take a look specifically at these 2, you can see that Europe ban actually resulted in more disruption to employee interactions. It's 49% versus 33% because of the China ban. Many of our respondents are multinational companies, so you can see that their teams were greatly impacted. With the China ban, it's evident that it was more impactful to supplier interactions. And with so many of our supply chains extending into China, you certainly can see this here. And we do in total $737 billion of the U.S. total trade with China, many of that being extending, as I said, into our supply chains into China. So it's not surprising to see the disruption to the supplier interactions higher for the China ban than for the Europe ban. I'll note that the manufacturing companies primarily drive this. Again, looking at our sectors, this the rate of this significant interruption to employees and to suppliers was more prevalent in the manufacturing sector. They reported it more often than the companies that were in the services sector or the process sector. Let me show you what this would look like for the China ban. Back up one. Here we go. So for the China ban, you can see for manufacturing companies, they were experiencing significant more impact to suppliers and employees than companies in the other two. And so that's why I say the manufacturing companies definitely were driving this, and we were picking up a lot higher percentages of the companies experiencing this from our CPOs in the manufacturing sector. Following the impact to the supplier and the employee interactions, then we looked at the anticipated loss of revenue. So you can see this here in the middle of the chart. Let me stress that at this point, we were asking for the loss of revenue due to the travel bans. Now, many companies are projecting loss of revenue due to various other factors, but here in this survey, we were asking specifically the loss of revenue in anticipation and due to the travel ban. So I wanted to kind of stress that point because we know people are looking at their revenues for many, many other different reasons as well. So manufacturing and services companies actually reported this equally. Far less process companies reported an anticipated loss of revenue due to the travel bans. So now let's look at the bottom three that I have circled here. It was interesting that there were some companies that were reporting no impact, minimal impact, and of course, some of those, a small number that it just did not apply, and these were typically very U.S.-centric companies, and those were the ones that reported it does not apply. But the biggest surprise was that, there were companies reporting no impact, minimal impact, and interesting to note, these were a variety of companies. So no specific industry, no specific sector. It was companies across manufacturing, across services, across process sector that were all reporting that, did report that some of them were either no impact or very minimal impact. I think it makes us realize that the impact and the shock of this pandemic did not strike everybody immediately and with the same intensity. It was more a wave moving through, depending on industry, depending on types of companies and sector. And it rolled through our companies and our communities and our families at very different velocities and intensities, not all at once. It's not like there was a date that everything came to a screeching halt and everything was impacted and everything, got impacted the same and was in immediate shutdown. Not at all. As I said, the dates ranges for the survey were going back just a week in time to 14 days in time. And at that point, some companies were not experiencing impact yet. So it's good to kind of just acknowledge that it is affecting different companies. As time goes on, more companies report a variety of different things, and we're certainly seeing this even here in the data. And hopefully, we're going to get beyond the crest here shortly. So the next thing that we asked about was the company and your entire organization. What are some things that the overall company is doing? So before we move specifically into actions that your supply management organization is taking, let's look at some of the actions at the overall company. So this chart is showing us the percent of companies taking these actions, and companies could select more than one. And so looking at the data, you can see that the initial shock wave, companies, the top three, everybody was taking these actions. You can see that these were the obvious actions: the imposing the travel restrictions, the activating your emergency response, and then moving employees and requiring them to work remotely. Let me show you this data by sector so that you can see not a lot of difference across sectors. A little less in services for requiring companies to work remotely, which makes sense. They're in the service sector. They're often servicing customers and consumers and customer equipment and so forth. So, less likely to have those workforces doing a work from home or working remotely. But these three were very consistently, at the top of the list, no matter which sector you were in. So let's look a little bit deeper into the remaining items on this chart, and I will show you some sector data as well. So more than ever, we want to be integrated into demand planning and forecasting and S&OP processes. And it shows us that 42% of companies at this point in time were changing their forecasts. And so customer forecast changes can definitely affect your supply base. And so we want you to be able to be as transparent as possible to your suppliers. So engaging with your forecasting teams, your demand planning teams, your S&OP processes is really, really critical at that point so that you know the impact of customer changes that you can then translate into what it means for your supply base. And also the opposite is very true, right? The insights from your suppliers and the availability of supply that you have coming from them can really affect what you can commit to your customers. So it's important both ways, that exchange of information and the integration of supply management into those planning and forecasting meetings and activity that you've got. So more important than ever. So definitely engage and step that up to really help both customers as well as our supply base in getting a balance between the two. On the next three, here I just popped in and laid in those forecasts. Obviously, manufacturing drives that a little bit higher than the other two. Okay, looking at the next three, it's a little bit about its spending, right? Whether it's expense and we're pulling back on discretionary spending or capital investments or expansion plans. So all sectors are driving this number. And as we analyze the data, you can see the impact by sector. Overall, it is highest in the services sector. Some companies report that they're doing internal memos that really limit discretionary spending, limit travel, limiting overtime, and hiring freezes, all those things that contribute to their expense base. Others, definitely reporting pullback in larger projects and investments and expansion plans and so forth. Our numbers here are less than 50% of companies and the CPOs reporting that their companies are taking these actions. So you might wonder who is not pulling back. The companies that we see that are not part of these numbers and are not reporting a pullback in spending, expansion, and so forth are some of the companies in the industries that you would expect when you think about it. The transportation industry, healthcare products, as well as healthcare services. Things like utilities is another example where these companies are not reporting the same kind of pullback that we saw reported by other companies. So this is what it looked like last week. What it looks like next week might be a little bit more aggressive in some of these pullbacks and reductions and restriction in spending. It really tells you how quickly that landscape is changing. The last item on here is furloughing, sidelining employees, layoffs, and so forth. Goldman Sachs just estimated that jobless claims will be more than 3.3 million, and up to that type of number, unprecedented number, within a week. Just a few days ago, on the 23rd of March, it was only 220,000. So a dramatic increase is what's anticipated in the jobless claims. And we certainly know that the travel industry, the hospitality industry are being hit so hard. Hotels furloughing tens of thousands of employees, airlines canceling flights. Just as of yesterday, Emirates announced that they're canceling all flights for at least 14 days. So to have one of the largest carriers to say they're canceling all flights is quite astounding. However, some of the airlines are converting their passenger flights to cargo, which really helps some of the constraints that we're seeing in logistics. And so, as time goes by, these numbers may grow, and I would expect the services sector that we're seeing here will have some increases in their layoffs and furloughs and so forth that they're experiencing with their supply base. If you're in a certain sector and would like to see how you stack up against the actions that other companies are taking in your sector, this is what it looks like for you. So we can see in manufacturing, their number one reported action that their company is taking is changing the forecast. Whereas if you're in process and service, the number one action they're taking is restricting discretionary spend. The list changes and the priorities change a little bit depending on which sector that you are in. And so here you can see how your actions kind of stack up against other companies related to you. All right. Now I want to go to our supply management space and what we want to share with you today are both challenges and actions of what your organizations are doing. And so I think this is the most significant part. So first of all, we did ask the CPOs, what is your one greatest challenge? If you'd have to put something at the top of your list, what would it be? And this is how they answered. So 31%, about a third of them said it's the increased demand for health and safety. When we look at the data by sector, it's interesting to see how the different sectors reported what was their number one challenge. And so I'm going to go slow and step through this so you can see what it looks like. First of all, here is manufacturing, and this is how they reported their greatest challenge. And so you can see what peaks for them is the decreased source of supply from the hot zones was their largest challenge. Now I'm going to lay in process. The process companies reported much differently. And again, someone asked for the definition of process. That's like utilities, chemical processing, power, some of those types of companies. So you can see that the increase for health and safety was their biggest challenge that they were experiencing, and then how the other ones fell as well. And then the last one that I'll lay in is services. And again, that's their peak, the increased demand for health and safety, followed by a variety of these other responses as far as the greatest challenge. We had included the price gouging in here, and I was so pleased to actually see no one had said that was a big challenge for them. So not that it's not entirely going on, but it was really good to see that that wasn't predominant in this question. So you can see kind of where the peaks are for each sector. Different things mattered differently to the various companies in the sectors. So people also provided some other things that were really major challenges to them that weren't on this list, and you may relate to them. So some of the other things that CPOs told us was lack of suppliers' continuity plans was their biggest challenge, or a supplier's financial health and financial stability being their greatest challenge. Another CPO told us that they now were really diverted in their kind of sourcing and supply chain activity, and they were responding and assisting with revenue-related projects and trying to help top line and revenue challenges. And so they were really stretched in that regards. A service provider gave us information around, the employee health. And because their employees are servicing the customer and servicing equipment and so forth for the customer, they were very concerned about employee health and cross-contamination. And then another CPO shared that they had a lot in their supply chain, and so they really had to be taking a look at paying for goods that they no longer needed, but that had already been shipped. And so, what could they do or potentially negotiate or figure out where, with this type of investment and with these kind of commitments of things that were on their way, but they no longer needed. And so, it was a variety, and some of these may resonate with you as well. Now, the next, here's the really important information for this audience, I think, and it's what the supply management groups are doing. So let's take a look. Everybody is doing the top one, right? Everybody's doing creating the contingency and mitigation plans. Then let's talk about assessing sub-tiers. We see 75% of the companies reporting that, this is actions that their supply management group is taking. And in this list, when we ask the question, they could check all that applied. So more than just one. It wasn't just, single response. We wanted them to give us a really, really good look at everything that they were doing in response to this pandemic. And so that second one is assessing sub-tiers. Now, it's never been a better time, right, for really strong visibility into your supply chain. And it's interesting. We have previous data that shows only 39% of companies did assess their sub-tier suppliers. So in some of our other kind of standard benchmarking and metrics that we have, we've captured that data that shows on a regular routine basis, only 39% of the companies are assessing sub-tier suppliers. Those are the suppliers that are going back into, tier 2, tier 3, and so forth. And now with this group, we see 75% of them, now doing this. And so I would say for any of your groups that have struggled to kind of justify this type of activity, and you wanted an ROI and you needed resources and you wanted to kind of have some proof that the investment in doing supply chain mapping and assessing suppliers, not only first tier, but into other tiers, is worth it. It is an expensive exercise. It is quite resource intensive, but an event like this certainly substantiates the need for this. And it's a good lesson learned, right? And so when things calm down, things get a little bit back to whatever the new normal is, hopefully these are some areas that you can revisit and go back on and realize that it's a good lesson learned, and having a really strong supplier risk management, including assessing some of these suppliers that are beyond your first tier, is very critical and really crucial at a state like this. And so those who don't have really strong risk management might want to prioritize that going forward, and now kind of have more or less the justification and the ROI for why it's so significant and important. Let's look at the shifting to alternative sources. Quite a number of companies, are doing that, especially with, border shutdown and so forth, right? So you need to think about when your category strategy says to single source, and you thought that was a really, really good idea to consolidate all your volume and all your spend with a single source. Now you realize it's not a very strong position to be in. So, incorporating some dual sourcing at a minimum will give more companies flexibility. For those companies who previously did a lot of JIT and, the low stock levels kept you very nimble in your supply chain and so forth, well, now it kind of presents a significant risk, right? And it kind of shows how fragile our supply chains can be. So we might need some dual strategies going forward to handle such a significant risk as this one. Now, with the logistics challenge, there's definitely an imbalance of cargo and containers. And of course, there's the reduced passenger flights by a high percentage. The numbers are just staggering as of yesterday as far as the reduction of passenger flights. And of course, a lot of these passenger flights supported your cargo shipments as well, right? Um, However, I think it's really, really positive that some of these passenger airlines, are converting to cargo. In fact, I believe American Airlines flew its first cargo-only flight in 36 years, and they did a Boeing 777, and it was at 100% capacity. So, that will help some of these challenges because we do have, the reporting of some doubling of international airfare rates, especially to the UK, to Frankfurt, and so forth. So some of these alternatives will help some of that, but we've got a while before things get rebalanced out um, with cargo, and so we do see, a lot of companies 67 report these challenges in logistics. The high sourcing of health and safety, any businesses where it's essential to interact and service the customer, we're seeing the supply management groups just scrambling for these kind of items. Now, maybe you have some suppliers in your supply chain where there could be some great innovation and great solutions for you. There's a great story from the retailer H&M. I think many of us know H&M as the kind of clothes store. They're asking their suppliers who are in this textile manufacturing chain to produce now PPE for medical staff, and then H&M is using their purchasing and their logistics to move this newly manufactured medical textiles. And we've heard some other repurposing of manufacturers to move towards PPE. And so these will help some of those constraints. But it makes, I would say, stop and think about some of your own suppliers where it's a possibility and a potential that something like this could be retrofitted to some of these high demand items. Increasing material inventory, this is going to be obviously a little bit more on the manufacturing side. I was interested. I was wondering how many companies were really taking a look at inventories and trying to stockpile a little bit more and so forth. And so we had 50% of these CPOs saying, yes, they were doing that. I was curious to see what that number is. So if you were thinking about doing it or wondering if others were, here you'll know it's about half of people who are taking that action. Renegotiating supplier contracts. It hasn't started a lot yet, right? At 19% of the companies reporting that this is what they were doing. I think we'll see more of that further down the line when there's more clarity for future demand and forecasts and so forth. But we weren't seeing too much of that yet. And then, as you can see, very, very few who are buying insurance to cover some kind of disruption. I will show you this data by sector and then talk about a few more actions that we hear that supply management is taking. So I'm going to show you these one at a time. Here you go, manufacturing. So if you're one of these companies, you're going to relate to these numbers. You can see where assessing your sub-tier suppliers, 82% of the companies are now have this underway, and this is the action that they're taking. So if you're a manufacturer, you need to be doing this and looking at not only your first tier suppliers and how they impact you, but some of those other tiers as well. Logistics obviously is going to be high when you're a manufacturer, just like shifting to the alternative sources and so forth. So you can see the percent of companies in the manufacturing sector that reported this was their supply management actions. I did not include the one at the top of the list, the creating contingency and mitigation plans, because everybody's doing that. I mean, we have 97% of the companies doing that across the board. So that particular one isn't in the breakout chart, but here you can see manufacturing. I will give the process people now a chance to look at theirs, and they can see where their challenges are and what actions their supply management groups are taking. You can see what the predominant activities are here. You can look at some of your own activities, see how they stack up to some of your other peers and so forth out there, and things that they are taking on and doing. And it probably relates very well to the things that you are doing. And then I'm going to give our services companies a chance to look at theirs. So here's yours. 67% of the companies reporting assessing the sub-tier suppliers and shifting to alternative sources as well. And then the really, really high percentage of companies also sourcing of the health and safety. This is where we see that percentage kind of peak the highest. So you can see how you relate to those. I'll give you the chart all together. It gets a little busy, but you can see across these sectors, it depending on what sector and the obviously characteristics of that sector, you can see how it does change. And so that's why when we divide our data down into sectors, it gives you a little more transparency into the data and becomes a little more relatable, because it may feel and look very different if you're a manufacturer versus services company. So giving that to you kind of all in there so you can see the dynamic landscape of that. So to give you a few more ideas of some of the activity going on, I'm going to let you take a look at this list and kind of comment on some of these things. So we see a lot of letters and communications to suppliers. So this is an activity that you may have taken already, but the nature of these letters can look very different. So obviously, at first, we saw a lot of letters come out refraining from company site visits and so forth. Then the next wave came out, very different content. If you are in what's considered the essential critical infrastructure types of companies and businesses, so you're a company in food and health and those types of things that are critical to keep our infrastructure healthy and operating, then you are a mission critical company, and hence your suppliers are mission critical suppliers according to the Department of Homeland Security. So we have seen for the very first time in many cases companies issuing these letters out to their suppliers saying that their suppliers are in this category, and even though states shut down, businesses shut down, people have mandatory shutdowns, they can maintain normal work because they are part of this classification of essential critical suppliers. So that's an important one that we're seeing companies issue if they're in that category. Now, another type of letter that we're seeing, which is interesting, is we are seeing some companies put out letters to their suppliers addressing pay terms. And they are cautioning the suppliers that pay terms may have to push a bit. They're restructuring some of their milestone payments and so forth. So we see that type. And then we see the opposite. We see companies adamant about no change in supplier payments, that accounts payable will keep operating per the standards. They're not going to delay payments, and they want to really help suppliers with their financial stability. So we see both sides of that. So kind of interesting what's going on there. So the second one, ensuring that your suppliers' business continuity plans are activated. And so, working with them to make sure that, they've have things in place and activated and so forth. And some of the learnings and best practices that you have, you can certainly share with your suppliers. We see supply management group vetting new suppliers where they have to find new sources, additional sources. So a lot of that's going on. We see supply management groups and they're reporting that they're working a lot of cash flow plans, both internally and with suppliers. Now, this is where you might want to think about supply chain financing for your suppliers. This might be a mechanism, a tool to help your suppliers with their cash flow in considering some supply chain financing options for them. If you feel you're not that well versed on supply chain financing, actually in our CAPS library, there's a really good paper and a research piece on supply chain financing that talks about different methods and approaches and so forth. And that might give you even some helpful information as you consider this in assisting some of your suppliers. I'm not going to read all of these, but number 6, force majeure. We see that coming in different ways. Risk Methods has reported that there's a 44% increase of companies declaring this. Some companies are trying to get out ahead of it just to really make sure that it's legit and fair and so forth. So we do see supply management groups looking at that, and we also see some supply management groups thinking about best practices going forward about how and when to include force majeure and some improvements in that or in the language that they may or may not have. Definitely supply management groups are instrumental in planning for reduced revenue that the company may be anticipating or experiencing. So it's kind of the typical activity. It's that demand management. It's reviewing open recs and can you cancel them? Do you really need them? How important is it? What kind of priority? Reviewing existing commitments. Can you terminate, reduce, postpone, reposition, work with your suppliers in a way that's not detrimental to them, but yet works win-win, for both of you, for both of you able to adjust. Skipping down a bit, 9, negotiating some deposits and refunds and so forth. But 10 is a lot of cancels being traveled, right? And so to track those refunds and track travel credits is some of the things that they're reporting they're working on. And so you can kind of see a few of the other ones that are on the list. So one thing on the very bottom of the list, 14, encouraging community service and outreach. I actually want to do a little plug here. A lot of people are encouraged to do this virtually. However, one thing that we know is really, really struggling is blood donations. And American Red Cross has always been a huge, huge, great supporter of CAPS research. And I know they would appreciate me saying, if you can donate blood, or even if your company could host a blood drive, it's greatly, greatly needed in times like this. And so I am going to take the opportunity and put that little plug in there as we all want to help our communities as well. And as we conclude today, I just really want to thank you for your participation and attendance. We are certainly in uncharted territory, and for many of you, this will be probably the biggest crisis that you will experience in your career. And I would say it's more critical than ever that our procurement and our supply management organizations are really instrumental in getting our companies and our communities, back to healthy levels of operations. So the team here at CAPS, thank you and wish you health and safety to all. And with that, I will turn it back over to Nicole.
Thanks, Deb. We do want to thank you for joining us today. I hope that you were able to gain some information as we work through this difficult and uncharted territory. The presentation slides are available now. If you haven't already, you'll need to create an account on the CAPS library to access the information. We also have a coronavirus resource page that's shown there, and all of these things, along with some member and non-member reports, will be available for you to access there as well. So thank you so much. We do appreciate everybody's help today, and we hope you enjoyed it.